The largest manhunt in the history of the state of Minnesota took place last month. After nearly 2 days of searching, the police arrested the suspect, a Minnesota man named Vance Boelter. Mr. Boelter is accused of killing Democratic State Representative Melissa Hortman, her husband, and their dog, and critically wounding another state legislator and his wife. If convicted, he faces a maximum sentence of life in prison or, possibly, the death penalty. While Mr. Boelter was being pursued, according to prosecutors, he sent a text message to his wife and 5 children. The message said, "Dad went to war last night." But he didn't leave a manifesto explaining his actions. So 2 of my colleagues, Ernesto Londoño and Ruth Graham, and I, set out to understand what might have motivated him. And we wrote a story that I'll read to you in a moment. We spoke to old friends, college classmates, former work colleagues, and others to chronicle who this man was before the shooting, his passionate faith in Jesus Christ, the professional misfortunes he had gone through, and, apparently, his gradual mental decline. We read through dozens of land records and public documents going back 30, 40 years. Perhaps the most valuable and most surprising moment came when my colleague Ernesto reached out to Vance Boelter at the county jail where he is being held, and Mr. Boelter responded. There's a kind of online email service that you can sign up for, and you have to pay for it. And if the inmate is amenable to a conversation, an email or text message conversation can begin. Ernesto took a shot, and it worked. So, over the course of 2 days, Ernesto and Mr. Boelter were having an illuminating correspondence because it filled in details or corroborated things in the chronology of his life that we had assembled. But also because, quite frankly, the exchanges were hinting of having a disconnect from reality. He intimated that as a 17-year-old boy, he was recruited into some mysterious conspiracy with the United States military. He suggested that had something to do with the events of June 14th. He also wrote something rather cryptic. He said, quote, "Because I love my neighbors, prior to June 14th, I conducted a 2-year-long undercover investigation." We have no idea what he's referring to. Ernesto asked him other questions as well, and he wouldn't directly answer whether he actually committed these crimes. And then when Ernesto asked him if he had anything to say to those people who were grieving in Minnesota, he said that death is always sad. This correspondence suggested a man in the throes of like a grandiose delusion, someone who saw himself as chosen maybe to save the country by taking extreme action. Mr. Boelter was 17 years old when he became a born-again Christian. A couple of years ago, he became associated with an evangelical church in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where more than once he gave sermons recalling his religious experiences. And Mr. Boelter and his wife were also supporting all sorts of faith-based ventures with whatever income they made from buying and selling properties. I reached out to a young woman who had rented property from Mr. Boelter and his wife in Iowa. She wrote back to me this extraordinary email describing Mr. Boelter and his wife as upstanding people who were there for her when she and her children were going through a personal crisis. She vividly remembers Vance Boelter checking in on her, and for nearly a year, telling her to pay only what she could afford. This was very, very kind, she said. So, a couple of years ago, Mr. Boelter was the kind of guy who would help a woman who's in a personal crisis and not charge her for her housing. And then, 2 years later, he's the guy who is charged with cold-bloodedly killing and wounding several people, while also having a list of dozens of other public officials that he apparently intended to kill. You know, you can never really be entirely in the head of someone else, particularly someone who seems to be exhibiting notions that don't seem to make much sense. I think we knew that and did the best we could to get some sense of who Vance Boelter is and where he was coming from. And what we found is that Mr. Boelter's worldview was darkening as his fortunes declined, and his private life was much bleaker than what his public persona might have suggested. Here's our story. The sudden change in the teenager was dramatic and unsettling, as if some internal switch had been thrown. Those who knew him could only wonder, what's come over Vance Boelter? One moment he was an affable college freshman pursuing a family passion by trying out for the baseball team. The next, he was giving up the game and shedding his belongings, even his cherished baseball bat, as if to put away childish things. Suddenly, he was telling dorm mates they were going to hell, denouncing a guest speaker on campus as Satan's worker, and announcing he was now all in for Jesus. It was a lifelong commitment he would just as suddenly violate 40 years later, prosecutors say, with an act of political assassination that would stun the nation and send his home state of Minnesota into communal mourning. Throughout his life, Mr. Boelter's Christian belief in the sanctity of life seemed unwavering. He told a church congregation in 2021 that all the world's wealth was not worth the value of the person on your left, or the person on your right, or the person you see going home today. But his worldview darkened as his fortunes declined. He moved from state to state, job to job. He went from overseeing large food service operations to collecting bodies for funeral homes, struggling at the same time to pair his spiritual and business interests while his wife homeschooled their 5 children. He began following a far-right website that trafficked in conspiracy theories about stolen elections and evil Democrats. He became distant. In the first dark hours of June 14th, prosecutors say, the pious Mr. Boelter, who's 57, set out to commit a crime that would break a commandment. He drove off in a black SUV, outfitted to resemble a police cruiser, with several firearms and the names and addresses of intended targets. Less than 2 hours later, a Democratic legislator and her husband were dead, and another Democratic lawmaker and his wife had been critically wounded. How much the spiritual and political beliefs overlap in the Venn diagram of Mr. Boelter remains unclear. So far, nothing revealed by prosecutors suggests that the shooter was motivated by religious fervor. But in correspondence with the New York Times through the jail's electronic messaging service, Mr. Boelter suggested that the bloodshed was partly rooted in the Christian commandment to love one's neighbor. Because I love my neighbors prior to June 14th, I conducted a 2-year-long undercover investigation, he wrote. His cryptic messages to the Times, which also referred to a mysterious military operation, seemed disconnected from reality and in keeping with the various handwritten notes of his recovered by law enforcement. They suggest a man in the throes of grandiose delusion, one who saw himself as somehow chosen to save the country by taking extreme action. Doing what most people know needs to be done, he wrote to himself, but are not willing to do it themselves. Vance Boelter arrived at St. Cloud State University as a gangly teenager in the late summer of 1985, fresh from being named the friendliest and most courteous at his high school in the rural Minnesota town of Sleepy Eye. He was intent on trying out for baseball, and the coach, Denny Lorsung, already knew the Boelter name. Mr. Lorsung remembered the freshman's father, Don Boelter, Sleepy Eye's baseball coach, as a good, solid man. He also knew Vance's older brother, Terry, as an excellent player, skilled enough to have reached the minor leagues. The long-retired coach still recalls the young Mr. Boelter introducing himself at the start of tryouts decades ago, and then, not long after, having the maturity to say in person that he would no longer be trying out for the team. As for why Mr. Boelter was giving up, Mr. Lorsing said he really didn't say. But Jeff Petricka, a friend who lived on the same dorm floor, knew the reason: religion. He said Mr. Boelter told him that he had met some people off campus and would now be leading an uncluttered life dedicated to Jesus Christ. He went from being a good, all-around decent friend to like a hypnotic zombie, said Mr. Petricka, who recalled buying a stereo and a baseball bat from Mr. Boelter for almost nothing. Mr. Petricca said that Mr. Boelter alienated dormmates by saying they were condemned to hell and disrupted a campus event by calling the guest speaker, a writer from Playboy, a hellbound tool of Satan. He was screaming and shaking, he said. He was just out of his mind. Writing this week to the Times, Mr. Boelter said that it was during these late teenage years that I was first approached by U.S. military about a program that pertains to my case. He did not elaborate on the far-fetched claim. Also around this time, in 1985 or 1986, Mr. Boelter met David Emerson, a slight, intense man in his early 30s who was attending an evangelical church in St. Cloud, Minnesota. No one, it seems, had a greater influence on the teen's spiritual development. Mr. Emerson had been a local eccentric in his Minnesota hometown, Osakis, who lived for a while in a teepee in a public park, tapping maple trees to make syrup. He later fell in with a group of evangelical Christians and traveled to Zimbabwe to do missionary work. When his visa expired, Mr. Emerson returned to Minnesota and settled in St. Cloud, where he began counseling Mr. Boelter. I met a believer who discipled me and taught me much about Jesus, Mr. Boelter later recalled. Mr. Emerson went back to Zimbabwe in the summer of 1987, but kept in touch with Mr. Boelter. Later that year, he, his fiancée, and more than a dozen other missionaries were murdered by anti-government rebels. After that, Mr. Boelter seemed intent on emulating his mentor. He chastised others for being failed Christians, printed a pamphlet to hand out. He told the Times that its title was, "He touched me in Sleepy Eye, Minnesota, and I have never been the same," and set fire to his belongings. "Burned it all," said David Carlson, a friend of Mr. Boelter's since the 4th grade. He also set up a tent in a park in Sleepy Eye where his proselytizing had residents calling him the preacher, Mr. Carlson said. He was a totally different person. Mr. Boelter doubled down. He ended his studies at St. Cloud and moved to Dallas to attend Christ for the Nations Institute, an unaccredited school founded 2 decades earlier by Gordon Lindsay, who had made his name as a traveling Pentecostal preacher, emphasizing miraculous healing. The Institute prepares most of its students, many of whom are from other countries, for some form of Christian ministry. In the late 1980s, students like Mr. Boelter followed certain rules: an 11 p.m. curfew, attendance at chapel every weekday and Wednesday evening, no beards or tennis shoes in class, and if you want to check out a basketball at the gym, you first had to recite a Bible verse. The students at Christ for the Nations debated several charismatic Christian theological ideas that encouraged believers to seize power on God's behalf, including one theory that some individuals could become immortal. Matthew D. Taylor, a religion scholar who has studied the independent charismatic movement, said that such institutions encourage believers to see themselves as agents of the supernatural, while also blending this sense of God-given power with an entrepreneurial spirit and a distrust of many mainstream Christian denominations. Some emerged from this culture to become influential spiritual and political leaders, Dr. Taylor said. And then there are all these other people, he added, who have absorbed the same messages about becoming these great figures and these world changers and can never quite get it going. Mr. Boelter never quite got it going. After graduating from Christ for the Nations in 1990, he returned to Minnesota and, according to Mr. Carlson, started a ministry in a town not far from Sleepy Eye. He drove around the state, pulling a huge cross on wheels, occasionally stopping along the roadside to preach. He always kind of took things way far, Mr. Carlson said. In his exchange with the Times, Mr. Boelter said he was licensed and then ordained as a minister by an organization he declined to name. He returned to St. Cloud State University, earned a degree in international relations in 1996, and looked for ways to finance his faith-based ambitions. He began by buying distressed properties, a vacated church in Arcadia, Wisconsin, for example, to fix up and sell for a profit. It was in Wisconsin that Mr. Boelter met Jenny Daskasil. They married in 1997 and soon had the first of their 5 children, Grace, followed by 3 more girls, Faith, Hope, and Joy, and a son named after Mr. Boelter's mentor, David Emerson. Around 2000, Mr. Boelter took a job as a supervisor at the Gerber baby food plant in Fort Smith, Arkansas. He and his wife sold their Wisconsin property and moved 800 miles south. After 4 years of working in Arkansas, he moved the family back to Wisconsin to become an operations leader at Johnsonville Sausage. 4 years later, he moved the family 400 miles west to become a manager at the Del Monte canning plant in Sleepy Eye. 3 years after that, in 2011, he uprooted the family again to oversee a food-to-go plant just outside Minneapolis. If the rootlessness disturbed Jenny Boelter, she didn't let on. On a form filled out for the 20th reunion of her high school graduating class, she indicated that her job in their 15-year marriage was to parent and homeschool their 5 children. "We have moved several times since we have been married, and I have always felt home is where my husband is," Ms. Boelter wrote. "I am thankful." Over the years, Mr. Boelter started several businesses and nonprofits that came and went. He managed a 7-Eleven in Minneapolis and a wholesale bakery in St. Paul. He and his wife created a security patrol company, promising to, quote, provide security services right to your doorstep, that never landed any clients. The Boelters continued to buy and flip properties. They bought an old church in Iowa, converted it to a rental unit, then arranged to sell it to their tenant, Gabriella Krull. When a personal matter worsened, the single mother said in an email, the Boelters let me and my children stay there for almost a year and let me pay them what I could afford. It is hard to believe that Vance could do something so horrific, Ms. Krull wrote, especially after how kind they were to me and my children through one of the most horrifying times of our lives. I only know the experiences I had with him and his wife, and they seemed like incredible, upstanding people. The Boelters also bought a ramshackle former assisted living facility in northern Wisconsin. Kayla New, a local real estate agent who helped the couple sell the building for a modest profit in 2024, remembered that Ms. Boelter told her they planned to use 100% of the purchase price to support yet another project in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In 2021, Mr. Boelter and his wife took a gamble by founding a venture called Red Lion Group, which focused on business and Christian outreach opportunities in Congo. Mr. Boelter did his best to visit Congo and network with its leaders. He also became associated with an evangelical church in Congo. There, more than once, he delivered lengthy sermons recalling his religious experiences, at times crying or dancing or falling to his knees. One of his messages, living for Jesus isn't easy. In the late summer of 2023, Mr. Boelter began collecting bodies for one funeral home in the Twin Cities area and then a second, to pay the bills, he later said. Working nights at this grim task allowed him to focus on his Congo project and other ventures, but nothing found traction. He and his wife bought a 4-bedroom home on a 12-acre lot in rural Green Isle, about 50 miles southwest of Minneapolis. They found affirmation at the Jordan Family Church, a conservative evangelical congregation that held services in a middle school, a half-hour's drive from the Boelter home. Serving on the church's prayer team, the Boelters would stand at the front after services to pray with anyone who came forward. Church elders praised them for buying African fishing boats and singled out Mr. Boelter for his missionary work abroad. One church leader described him as having elder vibes and asked him to lead the group in prayer. "I know Vance Boelter," Ken Krause, the leader, said with admiration in a sermon in 2023, according to an audio recording. "The man's full of the Holy Spirit." But Mr. Boelter's private life was bleaker than what his public persona might have suggested. Because he was on call to collect dead bodies in the Minneapolis area, he began renting space in a rundown house in the city that was occupied by 3 other men, including his childhood friend, Mr. Carlson. And because all the bedrooms were taken, he erected plywood walls in the living room, installed a door, and secured the makeshift bedroom with a lock. In recent months, it is unclear precisely when or why, Mr. Boelter started slipping into a different mental state. His mood darkened, more serious and not as cheerful, recalled Mr. Carlson. Mr. Boelter developed a strong distrust of government, especially Democrats. According to Mr. Carlson, he believed the criminal prosecutions of Donald J. Trump were politically motivated, and that a victory by the Democratic presidential candidate, Kamala Harris, would lead to civil war. He followed the InfoWars website, founded by the conspiracy theorist Alex Jones. In February, Mr. Boelter quit his funeral home jobs and returned to Congo, which Mr. Carlson thought was unwise. He came back and he couldn't get the same thing he had before, he said. The jobs didn't pay enough, and there wasn't enough work. The planning took weeks, scouring websites for names and addresses, searching for disguises, conducting surveillance. Finally, prosecutors say, Mr. Boelter was ready to spill blood. It was as if some internal switch had been thrown again. A man devoted to his Christian faith and with no known history of violence had suddenly decided to become an assassin. On the evening of Friday, June 13th, he asked not to be disturbed. "I'm just getting some rest before I go out tonight," Mr. Carlson recalled his friend saying. Hours later, in the early morning dark, Mr. Boelter drove off in his customized SUV to execute a plan of mayhem in the Twin Cities suburbs that, prosecutors say, unfolded this way. He went first to the home of Democratic State Senator John A. Hoffman. Wearing a flesh-covered mask and black tactical vest, Mr. Boelter knocked on the door and shouted, "This is the police," before shooting and critically wounding Mr. Hoffman and his wife, Yvette. Then he went to the homes of two other Democratic lawmakers. But Mr. Boelter's shouts and doorbell ringing at one house went unanswered. The legislator and her family were away, and his stakeout of the other house was unwittingly interrupted by an actual police officer, so he drove away. His last stop was the home of Melissa Hortman, a Democratic state representative and former House Speaker. Shouting that he was a police officer and wearing a mask and brown wig, Mr. Boelter fired rounds of gunfire that flashed like lightning, killing Ms. Hortman, her husband Mark, and their golden retriever, Gilbert. The gunman escaped from approaching police. In his abandoned SUV, its emergency lights still flashing, he left behind firearms and several notebooks with dozens of names of politicians, but few cohesively written thoughts, according to an FBI application for a search warrant. There is no manifesto explaining his actions, the document said, but it added that the notebooks contained some veiled references suggesting that Mr. Boelter may have acted out of some, quote, twisted and misguided sense of doing good. In fact, prosecutors say, while being pursued in the largest manhunt in Minnesota history, Mr. Boelter sent a text message to his family saying, "Dad went to war last night." Less than 48 hours after the shooting, he was found hiding in a field of tall grass about a mile from his Green Isle home. The sun had just set on Father's Day. Now, Mr. Boelter is in federal custody at a county jail about 30 miles north of Minneapolis, awaiting trial on various state and federal charges, including murder. His federal public defender, Manny K. Atwal, said in an email that Mr. Boelter intended to plead not guilty. His wife could not be reached for comment, but she has issued a statement saying the bloodshed of June 14th was, quote, a betrayal of everything we hold true as tenets of our Christian faith, while an elder for the church he attended described it as, quote, the opposite of what Jesus taught his followers to do. It is unclear if Mr. Boelter has undergone a psychological evaluation. When contacted by the Times last week, he engaged in 2 days of exchanges. He provided straightforward answers to some questions, declined to speak about the case under advice of his lawyer, and responded cagily to questions about his seemingly delusional claims of a 2-year investigation that, he said, quote, was partly initiated by the death of 2 people. In courtroom comments and in exchanges with the news media, Mr. Boelter has never denied nor confirmed responsibility for the deadly gunfire of June 14. But he has provided many cryptic, even contradictory statements, including that the violence had nothing to do with President Trump or abortion, but rather something much larger and more mysterious. In a rambling, largely incoherent letter Mr. Boelter wrote to the FBI director, Kash Patel, shortly before his arrest, he claimed the shootings were part of a dark political conspiracy involving Minnesota's governor and the state's Senate seats. No one was aware of what I was investigating, not my wife, family, friends, or co-workers, he told the Times. That is why many are having a very tough time understanding what is going on. When asked whether he thought that God had guided the events of June 14th, the gunfire that left 2 people dead and 2 seriously wounded, Mr. Boelter answered, "Good question." This article was read by me, Dan Barry. Kitty Bennett contributed research. Our audio producer is Patricia.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is going to do it for the morning, the evening, first reporting of the, evening news for July 23rd, 2025. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, it is not an act of God to cause violence, harm, torture, or anything of that nature. If anything, it was an act of the devil. And I hope that God sentences him to death. Because, for the simple fact that he, Vance Boelter, committed an act of violence, and Jesus and his son both condemn violence of any kind. Ladies and gentlemen, that is going to do it for this legal breaking reporting video analysis update for the morning of July 23rd, 2025. Firstly, if you did enjoy this legal breaking reporting video analysis update, please firstly like, comment, share, subscribe, and enjoy. Secondly, if you would like to make sure you're always up to date on all the things legal breaking reporting wise on the set politics, please follow me on my social medias that'll be linked down below in the video description. Thirdly, if you guys would also like to make sure you're always up to date on all the things legal breaking reporting wise on the side of politics, please hit the bell icon as well as the all notifications option. The bell icon as well as the all notifications option is located directly beneath the screen here on the right hand side of the subscribe button. Fourthly, ladies and gentlemen, please help me reach and achieve the goal of 220 plus subscribers. Ladies and gentlemen, the reason why I'm saying 220 plus subscribers is because right after we reach and achieve the goal of 220 subscribers, we have more subscribers to reach and achieve right after we reach and achieve the goal of 220 subscribers. Lastly, ladies and gentlemen, please stay safe and always look for the ports of light in today's unfortunate illegal induced darkness caused by the illegal unconstitutional Trump regime. And as always, I look forward to talking to you guys in my next legal breaking reporting video analysis update tonight. This evening, July 23rd, 2025. See you this evening.